We'll talk later.
Do you want to sit down? Okay.
No, I'm all right.
Okay, so we wanted to hear about what you came up with. How do we challenge whiteness, and what does it mean to operationalize these notions in our feminism? Yeah.
We were just thinking that being inclusive and trying to see different perspectives and not just hear it from your own.
So start to make room for additional perspectives and include them in your decision making and in your choices. Yeah, absolutely.
I think alternative or different perspectives, but also different truths.
Cooperation and healthy competition.
Okay, what does that mean?
Well, healthy competition, it's good to have some, it's nice to have competition and that type of thing, but you can get an extreme where it's unhealthy competition, where it's I win, you lose. It's a competition where hopefully people will interject win-win in that competition. Does that make sense?
So win-win.
Is it win-win? Or,
Yeah, win-win.
I mean, the one thing I think about is I used to train karate seriously, and my best training partner was willing to really work with me to really like push me, and we pushed each other, right? Like we kicked the crap out of each other, and there was such a level of mutual respect, and so I feel in some ways that it was about both of us seriously engaging with the conflict that we needed to engage on.
Yes.
Right? We gave each other our best.
Yes. That makes sense. My wife and I do that with Scrabble and cribbage all the time. Healthy competition, we still.
Okay.
So, and what I would call that is a critical learning community. So that, we have, Roberta and I have a big idea to think about, and it might seem like we're competing because we're coming at this idea with different perspectives and different ways of thinking about it. But the truth is, we're really struggling with the issue at hand, both of us having this end in sight of having the world be a better place, and the work that we do in that looks like competition, and it might look like an argument, but it's about critically challenging ourselves to really think about this stuff to get it, to make it better. Yeah.
But that, this expression my friend used to use a lot, we don't have to think alike, but we can think together.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think of Roberta Ross from Sister's Song. It's Women of Color for Reproductive Justice, and she says in her coalition building among women of color that we don't need to all agree to think the same, but we need to agree to work together.
Yeah, that must be working then.
Yeah.
I mean, the other thing that could look like is accountability. So we're accountable to each other in this movement. And so we're invested in each other as humans, and we're invested in the relationship, and we're invested in trying to be held accountable when things go awry. When we perpetuate microaggressions, we say things that are oppressive to each other, perhaps, and then we hold each other accountable in that. That's part of both of our growth in that. Yes.
Being willing to change.
Yeah.
Hold on to old ways of doing things, and also new language.
Be willing to change and have new language. Yes.
We were talking about redefining the standards within the movement. She was talking about how when you see feminism, it doesn't say, underneath it like feminism for white women, or anything like that. But I mean, that's essentially, how it started, and I think we should really try to challenge redefining what it means to be a feminist and what the movement is actually about.
So one thing I think about, so we have accountability to each other around anti-oppressive and anti-racist struggles specifically, right? And you know what? Being willing to change and have new language, redefine the movement, and let's talk about race.
Yeah, let's talk about it.
Right? Because the challenge with whiteness and feminism is that whiteness has been the norm. And so we don't have to talk about whiteness because we live it. Right? But so part of interrupting whiteness is that we talk about race and power. How is power moving to subordinate some and to privilege others?
And if we use this lens of being willing to talk about race and talk about power, we're going to see different perspectives and different truths really differently. We're going to be like, oh, this is about access. This is about the way that my colleagues and friends feel about what they have available to them. And that's a really important frame and perspective to add. So it's not just like, hey, how's this for you? Oh, okay. How's this for me? Okay. It's this critical lens of, and this being accountable is about looking at power and looking at access and looking at trends in that way, so that we can make sure to pay attention to each other in that way. So yes.
I don't know if somebody already said it, but I was thinking like maybe being more aware of other movements and like their needs and like I guess like uniting with them, because I know like a lot of times like for minorities you feel like you have to pick one, like I'm a woman but I'm also like a black woman, so I feel like I have to advocate for black people just because I feel like I identify with that more. I feel like there's inclusion with both of them, like we're both fighting for equality, so it doesn't, I don't feel like I have to choose. So I feel like once you see that they're together, like more people are like, oh, like you know.
So what Brianna's talking about is this, the dominant paradigm would have us many times adhere to the politics of distraction. So you pick your movement and you stick to it. And that distracts us from looking at what the bigger issue is around power and injustice. So having the ability to pan out and say, hey, how could we create coalition? How might we join movements to be able to do more work together? How do we keep people from having to pick? Well, that would include all these other elements so that people would feel like they wanted to be in the movement.
And I thought you might know about that. Before we go, I want to just quickly say, so within Black feminist struggle, Black women have we're actively involved in the civil rights struggle, though who we talk about are men, right? And yet, Black women were organizing a lot of the on-the-ground movements as well as driving the political thought. And they did so, and Black women were not interested in kind of supporting fully the white feminist movement because their issues were not talked about. Right? So, and they couldn't find themselves there. So, all the women were white, right? And within the Black movement for civil rights and social change, their needs as women were also not being acknowledged, and they were experiencing sexism within their movements, right? So, all the men were Black, right? And one of the first anthologies of Black feminist thought was all the men are Black, all the women are white, and some of us are brave, right? And so what we begin to think about, because we know intersectionally that we don't put on one identity and take off another. That we're living our identities all the time. And that we are exposed to oppression or advantage depending on where we are and what moment, right? For a variety of reasons.
So I just want to say thank you for that comment about like joining forces, because that's something that I've been thinking about too. With all the different movements that are going on right now, like if we all just got together and there's more of us, right? Like we could do something. But also what we were talking about in our group was the language and even the word feminism, which requires kind of this buy into a binary of gender norms, right? And how like if we could look at the way we talk about things and the way we describe things, we could actually have a massive shift in how we think about things.
Yeah.
So when we're talking about operationalizing.
Yeah. So can you say that for me one more
So
time?
it's like find the words.
Isn't that shift the language so we can shift our mindset, right?
Right.
So we can shift how we think about things. So start, instead of just expecting us to understand what a description is, like really calling out like, I'm this privileged status or this thing, or just calling it out.
Kind of building on the last, that where it says awareness of other movements, and then the comment that was just made about language. I believe it's also important to ask ourselves, what kind of media do we use to stay informed? And if we're only using corporate media or the trending feed on Facebook, then we are totally inviting ourselves to be fed by all of the harm of white privilege. But if we seek out blogs written by people of color, or news media, alternative media written by people of color, and people who do not define as woman or man, or people who define as poor, then I think we're starting to do the kind of information seeking that allows us to be informed. Because corporate media has a lot at stake in keeping us disinformed and misinformed. And I'm a college teacher. I often hear college students say, oh, I don't watch the news, I'm above the news. And I tell them, people around the world, primarily poor people of color, every day are dying to try and stay informed. And you're so arrogant that you don't stay informed. Why don't you find ways to get informed that don't feed your arrogance? And everybody goes, oh.
I think I heard that, John.
You've heard that, okay.
And you know, I think what is so fascinating about white supremacy is that it also is part of the American dream, right? That we got it good here. We don't need to rock the boat because it's good here. Everybody wants to be like us, right? And so we aren't hearing other stories. We aren't hearing other struggles. And when we begin to, it begins to shift for us. What does liberation look like? Because I do believe we are becoming. Yeah.
So I think one of the questions you want to ask when you're challenging whiteness is, who's creating the knowledge? Where is this knowledge coming from? So you look at institutions like the legal system, the educational system, and former speakers of the media, and who has the power to put those messages out there, and what language do we use, and what images do we see, and knowing the speaker and the narrator is very helpful, I think, in understanding whether or not it's reflective of the movement. So I think those questions are helpful.
And every research study is subjective. So as much as people are trying to say, oh, I'm objective, it's just numbers. Why did you even choose those numbers to begin with? Why did you choose that question to begin with? That is subjective. That whole process is subjective. So when people are like putting all of their work behind various studies or various, and we're in the institution. But that question about who made this, who asked this question, where did this knowledge come from? There's a newer, well, it's from the 70s, I guess, or 60s, ethnoethnic mathematics. Is about examining math in all the different ways and formulations and all the different possibilities that exist, and the way it's attached to people. So, you know, like if you ever hated math, which I'm one of those people, this makes it so much more interesting. And what Paulo Freire says regarding that, the notion of what becomes legitimate knowledges, the only populations that are considered intellectual are the populations that are in power. And we decide everybody who's not in power is not intellectual somehow. And that is white supremacy. And how painful is that? And how inaccurate is that? Standing next to one of the most brilliant people that I know. Okay. Do we want to go to the next thing, or do we want to?
I think we can go to the next thing. One thing that I also, so I think we're talking about this, but challenge colorblindness.
Oh, yeah. So colorblindness is not a thing.
Right? I don't see color. Right? And we acknowledge that this term of colorblindness, so after the Civil Rights Act of 1964, right? So after the I love having Michael. Michael's good with things. So after the Civil Rights Act of 1964, where it was no longer, you know, where we weren't supposed to say discriminatory things, where you weren't supposed to exclude people from working in particular areas. Really white men began to develop colorblindness, right? I don't see color. We're all the same. Now, what that translated to is we just don't hire any people of color, or we couldn't find any people of color, right? We're colorblind. We're all the same. And if you talk about race, you're dividing us, right? And when we think about a lot of the challenges, a lot of the critiques of Whiteness History Month, one at the heart is that it is challenging colorblindness. Okay? So, challenging colorblindness is one of the key places for us to operate. And for myself, as a woman of color, I also think about in what ways have I absorbed the negative stories and myths about myself and my group. Right? So I think about the ways that Black women have been characterized as hypersexual, as immoral, as criminal, as breeders, as inferior, intellectually inferior. And all of that is about the construction of whiteness, right? Because it's a binary. Whiteness isn't those things. And Blackness and people of color in general, so you hear some of this applied to different groups of color, right? And that they are that. And if I'm not careful, I can look at other people of color and I can say to them, oh, your situation is the way it is because you're lazy. I know, right? That's what I know about Latinas, right? That's what I'm taught. And that's part of white supremacy. So there's this imperative that we all have in decentering whiteness to really understand how whiteness has permeated us and how it comes out of us and how it even affects how it fundamentally affects how we perceive ourselves and each other, right? And if we don't think about this, then solidarity isn't really possible, right? Because solidarity requires that not only do I see, respect, and honor, and engage with your humanity, but that I clean up my house, right? That I actually do work so that this relationship that we have is dynamic, that it is not just about today and good words, but it is about actions and both changing what I'm saying, what I'm thinking, and what I'm doing. right? And so I think about how, yeah. So anyway, I just wanted to put that in there.
So some of the terms for what Roberta is describing, internalized racism is one of those terms. And the
But for people of color, that we can internalize the racism of our society.
Yes, white people don't have internalized racism. White people have internalized entitlement. So that internalized white supremacy is an internalized white entitlement. So that's an important thing to know. And the horizontal racism is also
that practicing racism between people of color.
Yes.
Yeah, and that what's so useful about horizontal racism in thinking about why it is used within white supremacy is that white people don't have to be in the room.
They don't have to do the work. Yeah.
Right? It can be so pervasive. But it's important for us to really, then I will come to you right now, okay? Forgive me, Fred. It's important for us in thinking about our work that on one hand, yes, systems of oppression operate at the level of the individual, right? And so we here are doing some work to clean up our house, right? We are seeking to learn more and to think, to do better. Now, we recognize that there are, so we think individual and interpersonal dynamics, but there is a big cultural, how do you spell cultural? You see me a little team. Okay. That cultural oppression is huge, right? It is in our education, it is in our language, it is in our religion, it is in the art that we love, it is in our standards of beauty, it's in our sports events, right? It is very pervasive, okay? And then we also think about the ways that we interrupt that. And institutionally, that it is the policies, practices, and procedures, right, that govern us. And that we are being governed by PCC, we are being governed by the Oregon University system, we are being governed by the federal government, we are being, and then these institutions, it's not just one, right, that shape our lives, but it's this relationship of different institutions coming together that have structurally created the racist outcomes that we see, right? So, right? So this is structural. That this is about these interrelationships coming together. These different institutions reinforcing each other. So if we begin to think of this more as a system, as opposed to, I'm just going to focus on this one person who said something racist. Right? That's where we often go. I'm going to focus on that person, and I told them that racism is over. Booyah! Right? And culturally and institutionally, it's still doing its thing. Right? So what we want to think about, and I think that this is someone in the back said, I want to be hard on the issue, soft on the problem, or soft on the person, or something
on the issues and easy on the people.
Easy on the people? Yeah.
Kind
Yeah.
or, you know, but be tough on the, so like educate from a place of love and not hate, not, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you know, I also want us to think about that on a macro level and understanding the ways that cultural and institutional and structural oppression are at work in what we see. So our solutions need to be multimodal. They can't just be a one solution. Make sense? I feel like
So what Roberta's also talking about is that racism is systemic and systematic. So systemic meaning running through all the systems of society, and systematic meaning in a pattern over and over again. So what we hear a lot of people say is, well, I'm not. And because we have this pattern over and over again, and because it's part of our systems, we are. And we have to be accountable to that, and we have to figure out how we are, what that looks like, and how to flip it. What would real social transformation look like? That should be the question we're asking ourselves every morning when we get up. What would it look like? We have a person over here who's been wanting to say something, so I want to get to you. It's Brianna.
Yeah. Oh, I was going to say, it was interesting you were talking about colorblindness and like the dangers of it. So it reminded me of like this poem that was talking about, like if we were to say like all lives matter in like the 1800s, and basically like it sounded so strange to say like, oh, because I own slaves, like I'm not racist, you know, like it gives examples about like how like racism isn't correlated to color or things like that, like it didn't matter. But hearing it now, like it sounded crazy, but the way that they normalized it, like at the time would have sounded perfectly fine. And it makes you realize like today, how do the things that we say now, that we say like when we don't see color, like what does that do to like a society? And I was thinking about that, like the more that we say like I don't see color or there's not racism, we try to like prove it, it does not only like internalize like the racism that you were talking about and the feeling of not feeling good enough or that it's my personal fault and it's not systemic, it also normalizes it. And I think that the goal for feminism or, you know, equality should be that in future generations that it's not normalized. Like we look at these things that we say are, it's okay, like it's not a big deal, or it's just me, like we look back and we, like say if I were to write a poem, like they're writing about it now and saying like, oh, that sounds crazy, you know, like just changing that, like there is a problem and we want to know like, how can we take that, like there's no color out of it to make it more equal?
Well, one of the things that I often think about is this notion of equity versus equality, right? So one feminist notion has been equality between the genders, right? Now, on one hand, great. And on the other hand, in a racist society, my thought is equality with who? Right? Do I want equality? Is it that I want equality with Mitt Romney? Is it that I want, because as a black woman, if I'm having equality with black men, our society is still oppressing our community, right? So what becomes more useful to think about is equity. Right? What is the process? What are the needs and barriers to access, barriers to living a full life? And in what ways do our different identities expose us to different forms of oppression? And then therefore, what solutions, what targeted solutions can we begin to develop that will address inequities within our societies? But universalism won't get us there.
Yeah, even when we say between the genders, that piece about feminism too. Like, gender is the universe and I'm a star. Then there's not just two. It's a whole complex configuration of possibilities. We'll have to take one more and then we're going to get to our question. Or our
I have this question, one kind of question, because whiteness is socially constructed to create a system of hierarchy. So basically, so we're keeping, like it always seems to come down to the money. Like these folks that have the money and have the hierarchy and have the higher class want to stay there, and they use racism to keep, roads being built, workers with, you know what I'm trying to say? To try to keep the oppression and the racism going so that they can maintain themselves.
Yeah, I mean, and the very, very best thing about racism or oppression is that it's socially constructed. That means that it can be socially deconstructed, yes. That means that we constructed it one way so we could construct it a new way. If there could be a good thing about these egregious things, I mean, that's a hard thing to say. But it does mean that we could create new social constructs. We do have to think of ourselves as visionaries. We do have to take these things into account. We do have to think about, where do I have agency to engage in real social change? What would that transformation look like? What's the vision I hold? Who's missing? We could have a whole new social construction. The challenge with talking about these things as social constructions is that people are like, oh, well, they're just thoughts, so they're not very real. But they're social constructions with material outcomes. So that's a really important piece. So what if we made new social constructions with new material outcomes in mind? That's what I want to hold for this collective. The next thing we wanted to do is talk a little bit about some of the definitions that we've considered as we've gone today. Okay. I'm trying to like gauge the time that we have and the volume of words that we think are important. So because we are academics, we think everything's important. This is what happens sometimes. So I'm just going to go over a few of the key terms that we haven't really touched on, or we might have kind of glossed over a little bit, and then invite you to think more deeply about each of the other terms that we haven't discussed. So I'm going to start with cumulative impact. Cumulative impact is an important thing for all of us to understand and to know, because every single moment that happens between people is not happening in a vacuum. We have a whole lifetime of experience that is informing this very moment always. And so recognizing that for people, when people are like, hear some kind of microaggression and then seem like they're like really, really outrageously upset. It's important for us to be like, this is cumulative impact. Like maybe I wouldn't get outrageously upset at this moment, but I'm recognizing that this person has heard this thing 4,000 times. And this is about their identity, and it's about who they are, and it's about what they bring, and I need to hold that and hear that, because the cumulative impact cannot be denied. So that's an important piece. Mutuality. Do you want to talk about mutuality?
So mutuality, Bell talks about mutuality and that it is about relationships of sharing and respect, free of domination and subordination. Right? So with mutuality, we have to really actively engage in thinking about what does it look like to not engage with each other in a relationship of domination and subordination, because we live in a society that has taught us how to do that. Right? And part of that, I think of the denial of people's stories. Right? So when we hear something that we don't want to hear, right? When we hear someone say, I think this is about race, this is how I understand this. And sometimes I'll hear people say, well, it's not about that, right? It's about this over here. And if we're thinking about mutuality, I'm going to hold both. Right? And I'm also going to acknowledge that when I say it's not about that, that is about setting a dominant narrative for what it is about. Does that make sense?
Intent versus impact.
Yeah.
So lots of really well-meaning people who have the very best intentions in mind will do something, and then the impact is that it makes a big mess. So the hope is that that we will have good intentions. The other hope is that we will take feedback when the impact is not what we intended, and that the intention is not being responsible for our intention is key. So what are your intentions? I mean, we could have said that about going around the room today. What are your intentions for being here? We wouldn't have time, unfortunately, but it would be lovely to know. What are your intentions for being here? Why are you showing up in the room? And then the impact is like, what is the result of having shown up in the room? What does that mean? So that impact is an important thing to be assessing and thinking through. And we want, I would say, really good activists, really good allies are trying to consider balancing those things. So we shift our behavior to match our impact and the impact that we desire. So we keep figuring out how to, so the impact wasn't what I anticipated. My intentions were good, but that's not actually good enough. My impact wasn't what I had hoped. So what can I do now? What do I do differently next time? How do I keep learning and growing and developing so that these things feel more congruent and I'm received as such?
I think also of a student, one of my students teach me a lot. And I had a white student in my woman of color in the US class. She was so smart. Such a smarty. And she came to my class. She was in the class, and she was, very good at like saying what she thought, right? And she said, "I need to meet with you." And I said, "Great." So she comes to meet with me, and all of you should be meeting with your teachers, by the way, just so you know. Students who go and meet with their teacher get better grades. Just telling you. So she said, "I noticed my mom taught me that part of my feminism was to speak my mind. Right? I was raised that I am being a good feminist when I say what I think."
And this is a white woman in a woman of color feminisms class.
And she said, but I'm noticing that I'm speaking a lot and that other people aren't. And that I'm actually taking up more space than I need to, and that there's something off. And so we talked about, well, what does it look like to step up and to step back? Right? And that for her, she was really, and no one in the class was challenging her, but she was really looking for what is the impact that I am having? And am I like centering myself and my experience? Am I asking that in this woman of color class, that these women of color experience this in the same way that I do? Right? And so part of mutuality is also this negotiation, right? And intent and impact really helps us. And one thing I really admired about her as well, there's an article called White Fragility, and it's really challenging how one of the ways that whiteness also gets kind of reaffirmed is that when challenging whiteness, white people feel that they're going to fall apart. Right?
And that's that discomfort versus unsafety kind of thing too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But to grow, like, you think about a meaningful relationship, if someone loves you, they're telling you what they see, right? And that there's a back and forth, right? That it's not just one telling and the other simply listening, but that there is an engagement. And that's how we develop. We don't develop by being perfect in this, I'm already perfect. So I think a lot about, I sing in a choir, and I think about if I don't sing, if I don't practice singing, I'm not going to be good. Right? If I'm like afraid of hitting a wrong note, so I'm not going to sing, and then I expect to be a good singer, you know that does not work. We've seen American Idol.
So, and another piece about this student that Roberta's talking about other people who are trying to figure out what's the context, what are the nuances here, how do I get conscious about how I show up in the work. This piece is about distinguishing behavior. The way that we do that is that we show up and we keep showing up. And we take feedback and we incorporate it into our perspective, into our ways of being, and we continue to change and evolve and morph, and we keep showing up. Like I said, it's a marathon, it's not a sprint. So one time somebody says, like, I don't like what you're doing, and the way that you're in the movement is wrong, and you're a bad person. It's really important to take that into consideration, figure out what can shift, if something needs to shift, and then keep showing up. That's distinguishing behavior. The thing is, I have a friend who was trying to meet ladies. He's a man who was recently divorced, and he was like, Sally, how do I meet women? I don't know how to do this. And I was like, well, okay, well, what are you doing right now? He's like, well, I'm in the bar with my journal and my club soda, because he's an awesome feminist, and he's sober, and he's really awesome, so, let me know if you're interested. And he's like, and I said, okay, and so let's say across the room you see somebody you really want to meet, what happens? And he says, well, I see her across the room, but I can't engage her. And I'm like, why not? He's like, I don't want to be one of those guys. And I was like, you know what, sweetheart? You are until you're not. And that's true about white supremacy. You are until you're not. And it's going to be a really long time until not is even a part of the story. So we have to keep showing up, keep having distinguishing behavior, and keep on keeping on. We talked about equality and equity. On the other side of the paper, I have these things that are dialogue pitfalls. Really awesome, really well-meaning people say the wrong thing all the time, and so I would recommend eliminating these statements from your vocabulary. So I'm going to go over a couple of them, not all of them, because we have to keep moving. Yes. We have like 4 minutes. So I'm just going to highlight a few that are important. So as people, as we're building relationship and thinking about ways of hearing people's truths and critically thinking about our own relationship to race and these experiences, if you want to be a good ally, these are some things to consider. Don't ever say, yeah, but. So you hear what someone says and you go, yeah, but. Don't do that. Don't say you're overreacting. Don't say you're too sensitive. So remember cumulative impact. Remember intent versus impact. Those particular elements are really important for us to be considering. And I think about this as a mom too. Telling the children in my house, people I love the very most in the world, that they're too sensitive or they're overreacting when they have strong emotions about something. And not remembering that they have a cumulative impact is really key. And I think that that's key in all of our relationships. That was not my intent, you misunderstood me, those kinds of things are not so super helpful. But being able to say, I'm sorry, is really helpful. I'm going to do it differently next time. I hear you, really helpful. So there are inroads and possibilities for us to participate in social change interpersonally and on a macro-social level. But we have to sign up for it. We have 2 minutes.
So, what we'll take is, how about either a word or something that, or one sentence that you will take away from this workshop. And why don't we, if I can just have like 6 of them. Yeah.
Sign up.
Sign up. Yeah.
This is actually a quote, and I hope you can help me remember who deserves the credit for it, but someone said my feminism will be intersectional or it will be bullshit.
I can't remember who it was, but the article's
it's
on the internet.
other words right now.
Yeah.
Great.
Gratitude. Gratitude. How about from some quieter voices? I will start to point. Yes.
Accepting others for who they are.
Accepting people for who they are. Yeah.
You are until you're not.
You are until you're not. Yeah. Maybe 2 more.
Challenge colorblindness.
Challenge colorblindness.
Pluralism.
Pluralism. And I think mine is gratitude for your strength to stay. Right? Because that in and of itself is about showing up. So thank you.
And mine will be hope for a community of people who are invested. I see your eyes when I say it. This is your charge. Come on. I see you going. I've seen people do that. So I'm totally enthused, totally excited, ready to change the world with you. Thank you.
A couple times back here, you made my eyes go like this.